in this pilot project, which has brought to Rice University and the Baker Institute emerging leaders from Central and Latin America, from the private and public sector, from a classical guitarist to a member of parliament, to private entrepreneurs in the business sector, a young generation of leaders who have come and who have debated and who have discussed some of the seminal issues in North-South relations. We took on this project. We knew it was a question mark, but I can report to you tonight that after the substantive discussions that we have had, and I believe the report that we are going to produce, that this is something that will become a characteristic activity of the Baker Institute in collaboration with the Organization of American States and the Greater Houston Partnership. The people just bonded together and engaged in a dialogue and debate that has produced substantive results. So I'm very happy to report that in this initial project. We also had Carlos Fuentes address the group and actually participated in one of the seminars on social responsibility in civil society. We had Cesar Gaviria, the former president of Colombia and the Secretary General of the OAS, who gave the keynote speech to launch the program and actually participated with the group in the first seminar on the implications of free trade and reforms in Latin and Central America. And tonight we are honored with our distinguished guest speaker, the Honorable Henry Cisneros, who I'll be introducing later, who will give us his views on the overall issue of the hemisphere, Latin America and the United States. We are creating precedents at the Baker Institute, and tonight we're going to create another precedent. And I will be conferring certificates of graduation and achievement on our participants, which I'm very happy to introduce to you in person. I would like to ask Michael Solar and Paulette Bethel to come up. Michael Solar represents the Greater Houston Partnership, and Paulette, the Organization of American States, who will help me confer these certificates. If you both kindly come up to the front. First participant, if you just stand, that's it. First participant is Cleophas Adderley. If Cleophas could kindly come up. This reads, the Americas Project in recognition of Cleophas R.E. Adderley, participant in the inaugural Americas Project on Trade and Reform, the political, economic, and social implications of free trade in America, Rice University, Houston, Texas, James A. Baker III Institute, the Organization of American States, the Greater Houston Partnership. Congratulations.
Great. Thank you.
Luz Maria Medina. Congratulations. Congratulations. The second person? Yes. Mauricio Santamaria from Colombia had to leave. We gave him his certificate with the group, so, but I want to mention his name. He made very valuable contributions to the deliberations. I'd like to call Wayne Chen from Jamaica. Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Alessandra Cummins from Barbados. Congratulations. I must say the ladies in this group kept me on my toes. Alejandro Lorenzo. Oh, I'm sorry, from Panama. Yes.
Thanks very much.
Fernando Lottenberg from Brazil. Armando Mayorga from Costa Rica. Thank you, Armando. Thank you very much. Andre Ricardo de Oliveira from Brazil. Felipe de la Piana from Uruguay. Congratulations, Felipe. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And last but not least, the person who really made me work hard, Beverly Ann Smith Lopez. From Belize.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Enjoy your dinner. I hope you've enjoyed your dinner and the company. It's now my privilege to introduce our keynote speaker and the gentleman who will cap our Americas project with his remarks and cap a very successful program and a new beginning. I must say that the Honorable Henry G. Cisneros came with his own rooting section tonight, not only his beautiful sister, but also a group of colleagues from Univision Communications who are here, and we welcome you. The Honorable Henry Cisneros joined Univision Communications, where he's now the President and Chief Operating Officer, this year, in January of '97. As we all know, from January 1993 through January 1997, he served the administration in a very important position as Secretary of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. As a member of the President's Cabinet, Secretary Cisneros was assigned America's Housing and Community Development portfolio. Prior to joining the Cabinet, he was chairman of Cisneros Asset Management Company, a fixed-income money management firm operating nationally. In 1981, Mr. Cisneros made history. He became the first Hispanic mayor of a major United States city when he was elected mayor of San Antonio. I think that was a round of applause. The nation's 10th largest city. As a four-term mayor, it's a pretty good record. From 1981 to 1989, Mr. Cisneros rebuilt the city's economic base and created jobs through massive infrastructure and downtown improvements in San Antonio, a remarkably good record. He has served as president of the National League of Cities, chairman of the National Civic League, deputy chair of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, and as a board member of the Rockefeller Foundation. He's been actively involved in charitable works and has a very keen sense of the needs of social justice. It's my honor and privilege to present to you our keynote speaker, the Honorable Henry G. Cisneros.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, and congratulations to you on your wonderful work in heading the Baker Institute and in organizing this activity. Mrs. Baker, Susan Baker, to Mike Solar and Mrs. Solar, and my friend Charles Miller, who are principally responsible for my being here this evening, I cherish their friendship and am pleased to respond to their invitation on any occasion. To my new extended family from Univision, I want to thank the Univision team and particularly Channel 45 who are present here this evening. Thank you for joining us. And of course, my member of my personal family, my sister Pauline, who is here. She is a researcher at the Baylor Medical School, and I'm very happy. I rarely get to see her, so I'm very happy that she's here this evening. And most importantly this evening, to the participants in this seminar, who undoubtedly will take lessons and insights with them to their respective countries, but who also will contribute greatly to the development of our region and the relationships between our nations, inevitably in the natural course of their work and development and leadership in their home countries. I once heard Henry Kissinger say that of the many things that had prepared him for his work as Secretary of State, the thing that he valued most was the set of relationships that had been developed over the years in short courses and seminars and academic courses for leaders from nations throughout the world while he was at Harvard. People came to Harvard who later would be foreign ministers and company executives and chief executives of their respective nations. And he negotiated that with them later, having known them for 20 and 25 years. I had the good fortune to serve on the Rockefeller Foundation for a number of years as a member of the board. And that foundation, in evaluating its work over a period of time, concluded that its most valuable contributions were those that had been made to the development of leadership by investing in people, in scholarships and seminars and fellowships and academic courses. The generation of Nobel scholars and innovators and pioneers in every field, scientific, medical, political, social, artistic, by those investments were the most important work that the Rockefeller Foundation did. So it is impressive to see Rice University, the James Baker Institute, acknowledging and recognizing this particular kind of contribution to the betterment of our world. It's also a special treat to be with a group of people whose heritage is Latin America, because I'm being introduced this evening, there's a reasonable chance that I might actually have my name pronounced correctly. This is a treat for me. My sister knows the syndrome. Others of you may have encountered the problem who have difficult to pronounce names. Mr. Ambassador, perhaps you've encountered this as well. My name is Cisneros, and certainly will accept it with the English pronunciation of Cisneros. But Lord, the things that I've been called when I've been introduced. I've been introduced as Henry Cisnerosis. On another occasion, I couldn't imagine how they could have gotten it so mangled. And then about a week later, I was reading the style section of the newspaper, and there was a discussion there of how to remember a person's name, memory jogging techniques. It said, focus on a prominent feature on the person's face, associate it with their name, it'll help you remember it. And it dawned on me how I had been introduced the previous week as Henry Cisneros. That wasn't the worst. One of the worst, I was mayor of San Antonio, went over to welcome a medical convention. They must have been in deep medical discussions all weekend long, because they certainly had not bothered to learn the local mayor's name, the moment of introduction. This fellow, I noticed, had an expression that could only be called sheer panic on his face, because it's very difficult to get through an entire introduction and never mention a person's name. He managed it until the moment of truth. He could duck this no longer. He got his courage together and he said, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome at this time, Mayor Sclerosis. So after you've been introduced as a disease, you think that's the worst, but it's not. I was secretary and I had to speak over at the National Press Club. And it was covered by C-SPAN. And so, as happens on occasion, people will call with questions or suggestions or critique or whatever. Lady called, middle of the afternoon, said to my secretary, she said, I have a point that I want to make on what I just heard the secretary say, but I dare not pronounce his name. She said, I don't think I pronounced his name. And then she must have had a moment of sort of ethnic inspiration. When she took a whack at it, she said, I think his name was something like Cheese Nachos. So I knew that in accepting this invitation, I was coming to a place where I was likely to be introduced properly. Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador, and to Houston, and to Rice, and to this group. Thank you very much for allowing me to participate. There are so many dimensions of this that make it special. The first is that this institute is named for a great Secretary of State, Jim Baker, whose sense of public service continues to this day. He is in Africa, as you know, at this very moment, at the request of the United Nations Secretary General, negotiating a dispute in Western Africa. And I might say, on a personal note, the admiration that I have for the Baker family, not just the Secretary, but the equal sense of public duty that his wife has carried forward. As Secretary of Housing, one of our priorities as an administration, was to focus on the untenable problem of homelessness. One of the leading advocates for the homeless in our country, unlikely in the sense that this is a woman of breeding and taste and standing, but gave her time, lots of it, hands-on, to the problem of homelessness in America, is Susan Baker, a very special lady, and I'd really request your expression of appreciation to her this evening. Thank you. It strikes me that there's an interesting convergence in a conference like this here at Rice and at this institute, Secretary Baker, Rice University, and Houston. You know, many of the secretaries of state for our country came traditionally out of the Eastern establishment law firms and policy institutes and foundations, and it is proper that we now see the movement to the south and southwest of these important institutions, the naming of a Secretary of State, a President of the United States, President Bush, of course, and a connection to an institution like Rice. I was thinking about that on the plane on the way out here today, and it occurred to me that since 1964, when President Johnson was elected in his own right, that's 33 years ago, only one president has been from outside the southern and western crescent of the United States. That one person was the only president of the last 33 years who was not elected, President Ford, who was from Michigan. But in the time since President Johnson was elected, a Texan, President Johnson, a Californian, President Nixon, a Georgian, President Carter, a Californian, President Reagan, a Texan, President Bush, and an Arkansan, President Clinton, all from the South or from the West, 2 Texans, 2 Californians, and 2 Southerners, a Georgian and an Arkansan, indicative of some dramatic population shifts in American politics, shifts in power, and shifts in 2 important dimensions of the history of the country. One of them is the imperative for the creation of prestigious and important centers of learning and thought, such as Rice University long has been, but the investment in something like this institute moves it to national and international importance. It strikes me that, at least in thinking about coming here today, that is one dimension of evolution that we see in this conference. Another is the reorientation of policy interests, so that, to be sure, our national foreign policy relationships with the Atlantic nations with the European nations remain strong. One would say today, no doubt, the most important of our continuing policy relationships as a country. But this reorientation of population, power, and institutions to the South and to the West means that the nations that lie to the South take on an increased importance in American life, and of course the nations of the Asian Pacific Rim as well. It is clear that Houston is a microcosm not only of those kinds of shifts and that reorientation, but of how American public policy works and how the nation will manage its foreign policy in the long run. Houston's strengths and assets have oriented Houston importantly to the South. Its oil exploration, technology, research, and engineering capabilities, its medical institutions, its technology base of computers and telecommunications and the new media and the spin-offs from the space program, all of these have introduced Houston to the diplomacy of this era, which is trade, which is international commerce conducted in a regional context. Houston is not only a microcosm of why trade is important, but how it will work, the way it works. It's a microcosm in some sense of national trade attributes. Houston has long been a city that has been knowledgeable and respectful of the countries that lie to the South. It's been a city that has been experienced as opposed to opportunistic. That is to say, Houston's trade relations have tended to be continuous and serious and systematic, not just fashions of the moment that slip away when an economic opportunity passes. They have worked at this and built important institutions. It's been ongoing, not sporadic. It's been reliable and dependable. It's been a set of relationships that are characterized by mutual interest between Houstonians, Texans, and the nations, the respective nations of the South. Mutual interest and mutual benefit. Trade always works best, and diplomacy always works best when it is characterized by a mutuality of interest as opposed to one party exploitative of the other. And very importantly, it has been opportunity driven. It's been positive. If there ever was a positive can-do place, that's part of the Houston ethic, whether those opportunities were financial or job creation or the serious business of building the infrastructure of nations. Houston has been part of the equation. In that sense, Houston, as I say, is a microcosm of the way business will be conducted in an international setting. When these attributes or values are present, this kind of knowledgeable, respectful, ongoing experience, mutuality of interest, when these attributes are present in the nation's approach to trade, the benefits are clear. So much so are they clear that trade, as you have no doubt concluded as the meetings of this session have gone forward, trade has emerged as the principal instrument of diplomacy and statesmanship today. Trade is the principal instrument, as well as the principal end of diplomacy and statesmanship, to increase opportunity. A quick glance at the dimensions of trade as they have emerged over the last years make this clear. The benefits, if you will, of strong trade relationships between nations, and this certainly applies to the United States relationship with the nations of the Americas. First is the dimension of trade in enhancing the legacy of peace. I had the great opportunity to serve President Clinton and worked closely as a part of his political counseling group that met with him weekly. And I know that he personally has felt that one of the things he wants to leave for the country is a reputation for the United States as peacemaker. Now, this certainly predates President Clinton. It is an American ideal or hope that President Bush and President Reagan addressed themselves to as well, Secretary Baker, Secretary Christopher. But it is clear that in building this legacy of peacemaker, and let me just say, this is not just passive peacemaking. This is an aggressive approach to peace, an active involvement in peacemaking that we see in the Middle East, in Ireland, in Africa, African disputes, in the Korean Peninsula, in relations with China. Wherever disputes are, the United States moves quickly to reestablish the peace. And much of the instruments of peacemaking are trade. Trade as a promise that if peace occurs, greater trade is possible. Trade as an opening, a lure to bring nations to the community of civilized nations. This is the lure of trade in Eastern Europe to try to create stability and evolution in the arrangements between nations. It's trade as a lure in Asia to bring China to the community of civilized nations. So trade as an instrument of peacemaking is one dimension that we see today. Trade, a second role, as a promoter of democracy. The use of trade as a lever, if you will, to persuade countries that the opening of their totalitarian systems to peace and internal peace and justice and democracy is important. We see that in Hong Kong, where the world cries out to China to respect civil processes in Hong Kong with trade via Hong Kong being the lure to China. In South Africa, where it took trade boycotts to encourage the South Africans to come to the table on issues of apartheid. And trade being used today in various ways, different philosophies about this, on Cuba. Some feeling that trade embargoes are the appropriate course, others feeling that more trade opens up opportunity and the Cuban people would then see things about the world that would force democratic movements. So when trade becomes the sunshine in systems, as in Eastern Europe, or even in some places in Latin America, we see the breakup of nationalized industries, the opening of closed systems. That sunlight creates not only a more modern economic culture, but a more fluid, more open political culture as well. So trade becomes a principal instrument for the promotion of democracy. Trade is also the best hope to alleviate crushing poverty and the attendant despair and destitution and alienation that follow. Strong, vigorous trade relationships that break down older systems and open up opportunities, frequently creating discomforts and dislocations, as we have seen in Mexico in the short run. But the hope, of course, is for longer range stability in trade relationships, the kind of thing that we hope we will see in future trade relationships with Chile, the Central American nations, the Caribbean nations, Mercosur, and others. Finally, trade is important to the United States as a domestic initiative. Trade for our own domestic prosperity. Americans tend to understate the extent to which our own economy is tied to the rest of the world. But it is clear from looking at job numbers, unemployment rates, export levels, manufacturing levels in the industrial Midwest that so much of the United States' own prosperity, the most prosperous region consistently over the last 5 years or so, have been regions like Cleveland and Chicago, largely due to the level of exports. And, of course, within the United States, trade is important to build on our own multicultural advantages, where many Americans can serve as bridges to their home regions and home nations and create a meaningful role for themselves in United States society as the traders, as the transporters of goods, as the lawyers and accountants and others who will manage trade in the long run. So the emergence of trade as an instrument of diplomacy, as I said, of an end of diplomacy, is very clear. It was suggested that my remarks would be addressed specifically to Latin America. And no doubt you have spent the last 2 days talking about the importance, the benefits, the future, the next steps of trade vis-a-vis the United States and Latin America, the political and social openings that will occur. I'd like to take a slightly different tack in the remainder of my remarks tonight and talk about the caveats and cautions and admonitions as we think about trade relationships in the Americas. Forgive me if this strikes a note of negativism. I don't mean it to be negative, but just to raise some things to think about as we proceed to the agenda that you have worked on over the last 2 days. First of all, I believe it is very important that Americans understand the importance of respecting the sovereignty of individual nations as we embark upon trade relationships. There is a tendency sometimes for our large companies, multinational powers that they are, to look to the end objective of the most effective and short-term means to trade objectives and dollar goals, and forget the role of governments and the role of peoples in their respective countries. This is a very sensitive issue with some nations. My own familiarity is with Mexico, and I know just how sensitive Mexico is about its sovereign rights, whether it be over minerals and petroleum or cultural issues or matters of immigration or any other number of things. But while we don't want to find ourselves hamstrung by attention to the question of sovereignty, it is a critical question. We are not moving toward a world in which the right thing is to be governed by non-elected multinationals, but hopefully moving to a world in which there is a creative tension between the economic opportunities that companies offer and present, the technology and the knowledge and the expertise that they bring, but balanced off against the rights, the proper respect, the sovereignty of countries to have some say, have ultimate say over their resources, their directions, their peoples. We tend to overlook this question of sovereignty in an all-out rush for trade objectives, particularly from the private sector side. Beyond the respect for sovereignty for nations and their rights is a second kind of sovereignty, and that is a cultural sovereignty, the respect for the cultural traditions and the makeup of countries. This is a complex point for me, so I'll do my very best to describe it. What I'm really talking about is the difference between large-scale, modern, concentrated, high-technology approaches in countries whose traditions may be more associated with smaller-scale, entrepreneurial endeavors that can get squashed, swamped, overwhelmed by the sudden crush of a modern interface. This was driven home to me in the 1980s when I had the opportunity to serve on the Kissinger Commission in Central America, and saw there time and again just two ships passing in the night. Americans seeing things through the eye of our massively huge, complex, intricate society, and attempting to overlay those views on societies that were different in character. Different in character. I saw it in places like Guatemala, for example, which has its own beauty, its own character, its own personality, which could only be destroyed by trying to substitute a 21st century American trade culture on it. Our approach will have to be more subtle, it'll have to be more thoughtful, it will have to be more respectful, not only of the government, the sovereignty I described earlier, but the cultural attributes and dimensions of the place. And frequently, I think, this really is a question of size more than anything else. Yes, it's a question of tradition and history and artistic culture and a lot of things, but majorly it is a question of size, because our moves tend to be big organizations with massive bureaucratic capabilities. And in places like Guatemala and others, there's a long tradition of very small businesses, microempresas, micro-enterprises, that play a significant role in that society. This is not a question of primitive versus modern, please. It's a question of the way that country works and respecting its indigenous capabilities and traditions and some of the things that are beautiful about it. And so it's the difference between huge banking structures and groups like Acción Internacional that has the capability of making micro-enterprise loans so that women selling in the markets can continue to do it and not be undercut and killed by changing the culture to a supermarket culture. So these are things to think about as we think about trade. Thirdly, and this may give away some of my own democratic biases, but democratic with a big D, partisan biases, but I think it's very important that we seek not to exacerbate class inequities by dealing only with the elites and being blind to the implications of trade and corporate decisions that widen income gaps, trample on workers' rights, stagnate wages, impact living conditions, such as we've seen in the maquiladoras along the border, for example, where people are living in god-awful settings. I mean, I have seen with my own eyes. If I hadn't seen this, I couldn't describe children finding drinking water out of crates that are marked toxic, because that's the only way to get water up to the hillsides where they live, to live in the shanties where American companies have built, and the maldistribution of incomes and opportunities that follows. I simply say we have to keep an eye on this. It is not possible to be civil and just and celebrate our trade accomplishments if the end result is the creation of deeper poverty or deeper stagnation. I'm not saying that that is always the result of our corporate involvement, not by a long shot, or our trade. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is we have to keep an eye on the effects, because the long-term implications are massive on these kinds of questions. Related are issues of the environment and environmental degradation, even environmental catastrophes that result from headlong, blind commitment to a particular kind of growth or trade strategy. Asia, for example, is facing an imminent energy resource depletion. I read a speech day before yesterday by a Thai internationalist describing the dimensions of the environmental degradation that will confront Asia without a doubt over the course of the next years, largely a function of the rapid growth, deforestation, carbon particulate matter that will increase by 50% over the next 15 years in much of Asia. The potential for 600 million automobiles in China, a country that already is characterized by severe problems of pollution. So some concepts of sustainable growth have to be juxtaposed and balanced against pure trade and growth agenda. And finally, as unpleasant as it is to talk about it, there are immense difficulties associated with criminal activity and the obvious problem of drugs that have to be addressed in any discussion of commercial opening and trade. Obviously, the problem of drugs in America is pernicious, destructive. I can only tell you that in my work as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, a good part of my life was spent in urban inner-city communities, a good part of it. And I saw no more destructive force for the future of our country than drugs. I also know that it is not a problem of the producing countries alone, but a problem of the demand within the United States, and a problem of the lack of treatment, which only exacerbates the problems of demand. But in a frank conversation, an honest assessment must address also the problem of production of drugs in Latin America, in Asia, and in other places. This is an international scourge, and countries that believe that they can be producers but immune from the effects of drugs in their own societies are kidding themselves. Colombia is a case in point. Mexico becoming an example of the infiltration of drug cartels and drug lords into everything from municipal police forces and court systems and eroding the basis of civil society. This is an immensely serious problem and has to be part of any discussion of serious people about how we interface in this region, the Americas. In the final analysis, I share these with you not to cast a chill on your discussions of the last several days, not to cast a pall on these proceedings or the exultation about the wonders of trade. I am a cheerleader for trade. I open my remarks talking about all of the benefits internationally and domestically for the United States. But rather, I raise these to urge reflection on our larger purposes and on our longer-term objectives. The purpose is not a new imperium of mercantilism, a new domination of economic might. That's not the purpose. The purpose is not to enjoy a few years of resource depletion only to reap a harvest of destitution over the long run. That's not the purpose. The purpose are civil societies, respectful of each other and their sovereignty, with long-term prosperity and a better life for all the people of the Americas, which trade can make possible if we proceed in a thoughtful and respectful way. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to be with you here this evening.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. The only final comment I want to make is I cannot believe that you were not a participant in our deliberations because you hit on so many of the points that our participants discussed, especially culture, narcotics, and many of the issues. Thank you very much for capping our program with your insightful remarks. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.